Hey all, Alex here at your home of the Music Deep Dive, and it is time for part 9 of the record collection tour that we have been embarking on. I want to say to those who are watching this in sequence, thank you so much for bearing with the sort of delays in between videos. I'm going to be transparent and say that work has kicked my ass in recent weeks, and I'm trying to get back on the horse. And what easier way to do it than to do a video that requires no preparation whatsoever. I'm just going to talk about some music that I hopefully enjoy, and maybe in some cases I don't. We'll get to it when we do. So, when last we left, we were talking about the letter E, and this band is interesting to me because I own very few of their records on vinyl. Only 3, in fact. And they're not one of my absolute favorite bands, even from this decade, even though there is the Beatles association. I'm going to be transparent, of course. I'm talking about Electric Light Orchestra. This is a New World record, first chronologically of the ones that I have. It's tough. ELO is a band that I have never, transitioned into loving. I've always really liked them, had a lot of respect for them, but never have they been, on the absolute top tier of favorite bands of mine. I think the technical skill sometimes is more impressive than whatever emotions are conveyed. And certainly Jeff Lynne's production style is pretty incredible, although I can understand how it comes across as sterile to some, especially as you get into the 80s and the 90s and so on. The New World record, I don't think this is my favorite ELO record, but it certainly is one of their strongest collections of songs. I think it's probably top 3 for sure, maybe top 2. So I'm going to let the cat out of the bag. That Out of the Blue is my number 1, most likely my number 1 anyways. Show off the gatefold here as best I can. But Out of the Blue, to me, this record epitomizes everything that they stand for. Kind of all their strengths are really personified here, exemplified even. And for as much as I think there's maybe more filler tracks, quote unquote, in Out of the Blue than there are in a New World record, I think this album presents ELO in all its kind of bombastic glory. I do really like the kind of themed side 3. I like it when bands do that, where they have bands or artists where they have a themed side or a themed section of a record that doesn't necessarily transition into other parts of the record. Like the example that comes to mind for me right now, for whatever reason, is the Beach Boys' Holland, the 3-part California saga on side 1 of that record. I think that's a really just great little thing, and it's a break from everything else. And in both the case of Holland and in the case of this album, everything else is, for the most part, pretty strong individual songs, really strong in some cases. So this one definitely is at the top. I don't have Time on vinyl, but Time is the one that I remember when I listened to it just being pretty floored by it. It's one that could be my number 1 with Time. I'm not going to acknowledge that pun, except I just did. Like I said, I don't have it on vinyl. I do have Discovery, which I think bears revisiting. I don't remember loving this when I heard it. Because of how, at least in parts, it definitely embraces the whole disco thing. Which I'm not against disco. I'm not. But again, I think it has to be done in a certain way by people, generally speaking, who are not British. I will make a pass for the Bee Gees because I think they have a very unique approach to disco. But ELO doing it, I don't know. I think it works better than I want to give it credit for. I do really like Don't Bring Me Down. So, and from what I remember, Discovery isn't even really a quote-unquote disco record anyways. It just kind of has that association. So, is what it is. Probably worth revisiting, as well as the rest of the ELO catalog. Duke Ellington. Ellington at Newport. Still in the original shrink, original from this re-release. This is I believe I'm not mistaken, because I'm kind of treading the depths of my knowledge and memory here. I believe this is the first major live album. The first live album of really any sort of historical import, and there's a reason for it. The performances on here, that whole first side, and then diminuendo and crescendo and blue, especially on the second side, I think are terrific. Super vibrant performances. And Ellington is an interesting one, where he has a lot of historical import as a figure. I think a lot of his recordings are sometimes overlooked when we talk about kind of the great jazz artists of, the 50s and on. Like, there's a lot of very interesting Duke Ellington material from the 50s and from the 60s. Oftentimes, of course, he's working with younger people, but Ellington's ensembles were pretty much for his entire life kind of the pinnacle of jazz ensembles, or close to it anyways. And I think people, this record, Ellington at Newport, I think gets a lot of acclaim, but I think even his studio work is worth some level of reappraisal, because I think it does get lost in kind of the excitement around the fresh faces, the Davises, the Coltranes, etc., etc. So I don't know. I think it's worth a re-listen. Certainly that album is worth a shot. I'm also very partial to Money Jungle, featuring Charles Mingus and Max Roach. That is a phenomenal record as well, although I do not own that on vinyl. Shifting gears, my only Emerson, Lake and Palmer record, Tarkus. I found this for cheap, and I make that distinction because I am not crazy about Emerson, Lake and Palmer. Never really have been. I think they represent a lot of the aspects of progressive rock that tend to get on my nerves sometimes. Just in the sense of, if I listen to it too excessively, I will want to actively turn something else on. Is Tarkus their best album? I don't know. I suppose I would say it is, but it is pretty close. They have like 2 or 3 kind of in that top tier. And admittedly, it has been a while since I've heard it, so probably worth a revisit. But ELP, it's a cool record. I do put it back up. I do think that the cover design, for as wacky as it is very cool. Very, very cool. So there's something to be said for that, I suppose. I've not heard this full album. I think I've heard maybe 2 or 3 songs off of this. It is the most, I think it's the most famous record by England Dan and John Ford Coley. Nights Are Forever. It contains easily their most famous song, I'd Really Love to See You Tonight, which I do love. It's kind of that era, that style of late 70s soft pop that I am a sucker for. It's a really great song. Beyond that, I've not heard anything from them that I'm super crazy on. I don't have much to say about either one as vocalists, generally speaking. I think they're fine. Of course, Dan Seals, aka England Dan, is the brother of Jim Seals from Seals and Croft. And I guess there's some tonal similarities there, not a whole lot. And Dan Seals, I think there's more of like a connection to country music. I'm going off of like interviews and stuff that I've read. I've never actually listened to like a Dan Seals solo album. I don't even remember how many there are. Nor have I listened to that much like Seals and Crofts. But it is interesting to hear that connection. And I do tend to advocate for Seals and Crofts as being kind of an underrated early 70s outfit in that case. But in any case, I only really know the one song. I got I think, no, I bought that on my own. I don't think I got that as part of a collection. But I'll get to it sometime. Definitely not high on my priority list, though. Now, this record I like, though, quite a bit. Donald Fagen, The Night Fly. This is Donald Fagen, obviously, from Steely Dan. It's his first solo album, and I would say easily his best. However, I don't think enough people have given Morph the Cat the recognition it deserves. I think that is, I mean, really, all four of his solo albums are pretty strong, but I think both of his 21st Century ones, Morph the Cat and Sunken Condos, are really nice records. Although I don't think they have the vitality of this one. Every song on here, from the opening track IGY, of course, which is as good as almost any Steely Dan song ever made, you know, and so many other ones: Green Flower Street, New Frontier, The Night Fly, and Walk Between Raindrops. My old drum instructor actually introduced me to this record at first, because Jeff Porcaro was on it. Jeff Porcaro, one of my favorite drummers stylistically. And yeah, it's a sharp record. I think it naturally builds on some of the stuff Steely Dan was doing, but I think it turns down the excesses that are really starting to litter, like Gaucho and stuff like that, which is nice, is appreciated. Couple of Marianne Faithfull records, one of which I've heard, and it's not the one you're going to think of. This is her... See, I know with Marianne it's difficult because I'm pretty sure she released 2 albums in 65, I believe, is when this was released. I'm pretty sure she released 2 albums. I want to say they were both self-titled. So actually, off the top of my head, I don't even remember which one this is. Both of those albums are pleasant. I have heard them before. Plenty of covers on here, including a Beatles one, I'm a Loser, and then As Tears Go By, of course, which is a Stones cover. So Marianne is... she's a figure I've not explored very much. I think actually those first 2 albums are the only 2 I've heard, because I was doing like a dive into the 60s and I ended up stopping midway through. So I have not actually heard Broken English, which is the one that everybody talks about as being her strongest. And so I don't have a whole lot to say. I think I got this because, again, it's a cheap price. It's only $6 for this, and it's in really good condition overall. So it's on my list. I wish I had something more meaningful to say about it. But again, the benefit of having vinyl records that you've never heard of before. It's one of those things where sometimes I will go just completely on a whim if I've never even heard of an album. Sometimes I'll get it. But for something like that, if I know it's a prominent record, something that's well respected, and I know there is a very reasonable shot that I am going to like it, I will invest in it if it seems like it's a decent price, a price that I'm not going to get anywhere else, really. So that's the reason why you will get some prominent records that I don't really have much experience with in this catalog, or in this kind of collection tour. Marianne's the only real example of that so far in this video. I'm not going to pretend that England Dan and John Ford Coley are, the stuff of classics where everyone says you need to hear that record, although I'm sure it is very lovely. But this record, we're getting into Fleet Foxes, which I am complete on. So we're going to be talking about all of these bands, or all of these records. The self-titled album is interesting. Sorry, I should say, I think Sun Giant, I don't remember the specifics. I'm pretty sure Sun Giant has some level of vinyl release. I don't own that. I own the proper studio albums. But yeah, the self-titled, it's interesting because you have a large subsection of Fleet Foxes fans who say that the Fleet Foxes self-titled, like they haven't improved on that's the best. I don't know exactly where I rank it, but it's third or fourth for me. And that's not a slight on it, because I think Fleet Foxes have one of the most consistent discographies of any band that I've ever listened to. It's just that I think they improved on it in a lot of ways. I think there is a rawer quality to it. I think this is their most typically pastoral release, which is to its credit. A little bit of maybe like Animal Collective, but like a lot cleaner. Animal Collective mixed with mid-60s Beach Boys. And you really hear that Beach Boys influence in a lot of Robin Pecknold's lyrical themes, especially on later records, and in just how he approaches production, layered instruments, a lot of reverb. Truly fantastic stuff. Favorite song on here is probably Ragged Wood, by the way. I do really like that one. It's got a good pace to it. Really, really great driving song. A lot of these are great driving albums, if I'm being honest. This is cool. This is the 12-inch single, I suppose you could say, of Helplessness Blues. Grown Ocean being the B-side, I suppose you could say. So pretty cool find at a Half Price Books for only $10. So I'm glad to have it as a representation of how much I love Helplessness Blues, the album, which is right here. Depending on the day, this is my favorite Fleet Foxes record. It's hard. Again, it's hard to say. All these albums are so close together. But to me, this takes the kind of pastoral, woodsy vibe of the first record and really sharpens the songwriting. There are clear themes on this album of not fitting in, feeling like an outsider, feeling adrift. There was tension in the band at this time, pretty famously. And after recording, and I think after a tour, it was for this album that they sort of separated for a few years. And yeah, it's a fantastic product. What we got out of it was remarkable. I think every song is strong in its own way, even the shorter ones, like something like, I don't know, Someone You'd Admire. I think it's all strong. It's all upbeat in its way. There is a sense of like optimism or comfort that I find in the music, even though stuff like Helplessness Blues is, I don't think, coming from that type of a place. Although I will say, after all that, my favorite is probably Lorelei. I think that one is, I guess it has a lot of the same qualities as Ragged Wood, but oh man, I think Lorelei is just a beautiful piece. Beautiful piece. Crack Up from 2017. This is, I remember when this came out. This was one of the Fleet Foxes records that I remember the release process. Like, I wasn't a fan when Helplessness Blues came out. I wasn't musically aware at that point. But Crack Up came out right as I was really starting to follow new releases a lot. And I was super excited. Super freaking excited for it. And what I got, I thought was fantastic. And still do. I think it is a much more complex record than Helplessness Blues. Or maybe that's not the right word. Much less immediate. Just because a lot of these songs sort of, they kind of sit around. They grow on you slowly. It's very lush. Not a whole lot of songs that have that type of like movement that you get in a Ragged Wood or a Lorelei or even Helplessness Blues. They're meditative and they're melancholy. But that's part of why I love it. That's part of why I love this record. Highlights to me are Kept Woman. I think the piano on it is phenomenal. And I Should See Memphis. I Should See Memphis, I think, is a super underrated song. And then this album I have not spent nearly as much time with, but Shore, their most recent release. Um, this is I don't quite know where to place this yet. Still, as far as like my favorite Fleet Foxes records, because I've only heard it a couple of times. But to me, it builds off of the Crack Up idea in the way that I would want it to. These songs are not as dense. I don't think he could have made another album quite like Crack Up, as far as like having these really long songs with these really dense textures without people really starting to complain about it being boring. I mean, people say that about Crack Up as is. But Shore kind of comes in, and I think it is a little bit brighter, a little bit leaner at points, but it doesn't sacrifice the beauty. And yeah, I've got no complaints. I remember I'm Not My Season being the standout, which I think is the standout for a lot of people. But yeah, Fleet Foxes. There'll be more to come on that. There'll be more eloquent thoughts, because I tentatively will be doing a kind of discography discussion video on another channel, but more to come on that potentially. In the meantime, let's move from Fleet Foxes to Fleetwood Mac, and we have a few representatives here. 2 records from the Buckingham Nicks era: Bare Trees, which, this, I haven't spent enough time with the, like, either the Peter Green or the Bob Welch records to know, like, which ones really stuck out to me. I seem to remember this one being one of the better ones, for the most part. And the record itself is not in good shape. I mean, it's a dollar clearance record, so I'm sure I will upgrade at some point, in terms of quality of copy. But Bare Trees, happy to have that one. And the same goes for Penguin here, which I seem to remember liking a little bit less. But I mean, still, what can you do? I do remember thinking that Bob Welch was a way more interesting songwriter than I suspected that he was. And a more interesting, like, player and singer. And there's a level of advocacy that I think needs to be done with the pre-Buckingham Nicks era and the post-Peter Green era, because Peter Green gets his respect in certain circles anyways, because he's like a blues rock guitar god. But you don't really get the same for the Bob Welch and the Danny Kirwan era. And not saying they're better than the Buckingham Nicks era, because I don't think very many people would agree with you on that, but they stand out in their own way, for sure. But on to Buckingham Nicks here. Self-titled Fleetwood Mac record from 1975. This is an album that I tend to forget how good it is sometimes, because the absolute standouts, which, I'm sorry, for the most part are the hits. I think Rhiannon is a ridiculously great song. And Landslide is fantastic too. But those songs, I think, do stick out far above the rest. But the other stuff that you have on here, like Monday Morning, World Turning, I'm So Afraid. I love I'm So Afraid. And the guitar parts on there kind of reminds me of Brian May from that era, the way that Buckingham's like layering those electric guitars. It's very cool. So it's an album that gets forgotten because of what came afterwards, which I'll just show because, of course, I have Rumors in my collection. Um, and, of course, I acknowledge its greatness. But really, yeah, I think the self-titled deserves a little bit more hype than I think what it gets, and it's closer to Rumors in quality than people want to admit. But, I mean, like, you know, you can't deny Rumors. Most people know it. Most people with a record player of some description own it. So I don't think I need to say much of anything except that I think every song on here is great in its own way, including the songs that much less people talk about. Like, I Don't Want to Know. I think I Don't Want to Know is super underrated. And I do appreciate that after Christine McVie's death that especially Songbird is getting its own lease on life. I adore Songbird. I think that is a phenomenal song, a gorgeous song. And Christine McVie in general, I think, is a really lovely writer. You know, not the most innovative in the sense that you kind of know the type of thing you're going to get, but what you get with her kind of piano ballad approach is really strong. And then when she is writing like sharp piano based like pop songs like You Make Loving Fun, that's also really sharp. So you know what you're going to get, but you also know it's going to be pretty strong quality wise. And yeah, oftentimes, especially if like, you know, Buckingham or Nicks are kind of in a bit more of a rut, she's usually in there to kind of save the day or at least stabilize the record. Mirage, you know, I remember not really liking this album that much when I first heard it. I think it was kind of obvious at that point that there was like friction in the band, and I don't feel like the band really loved going in the direction that they did. Or maybe Buckingham just didn't, because Buckingham wanted to do Tusk, and, you know, say what you will about Tusk, I think it's a really good record, but obviously, commercially, that's not what they wanted to have happen. And even the hits on here, I don't rate Hold Me nearly as much as most of their other strong songs. Gypsy's good. Gypsy's quite good. But otherwise, it's an album I want to revisit, because I know people love it. Or some people do anyways. But for me, it was not one of the highlights when I ran through their discography a while back. And Tango in the Night is an interesting one. That's the only other Fleetwood Mac record that I have. It's sort of, I think it works just in the sense that you really feel Buckingham's presence everywhere here. And I'm not saying that, you know, this era of Fleetwood Mac is only good if you can really hear Buckingham, but a lot of the time that's the case, especially when like Stevie Nicks is pretty absent here, and the songs that she's like really front and center on, like When I See You Again, I don't think they hit the mark at all. But yeah, Buckingham is kind of on fire. Big Love is great, the title track. And then, you know, Christine McVie comes in with Everywhere and Little Lies, two of their best hits. And yeah, it's more uneven than I want to give it credit for, but admittedly, a lot of, even some of like the less interesting songs, Mystified is not one of Christine McVie's stronger tracks, but I still connect with it because I have a lot of nostalgia and appreciation for it. So, is what it is, I suppose. Dan Fogelberg, his greatest hits. My mother really likes Dan Fogelberg, and I have liked what I've heard. I have not heard very much. This, by the way, comes from 1982, so this would have been when he was still with us, I believe. Leader of the band is really nice, but I can't speak to the quality of his songwriting in general. I know he does maybe tend to get lumped in with some of the more sentimental singer-songwriters in a maybe not so good way, but I usually don't take that kind of criticism that seriously. I can usually find something to appreciate. Um, so I look forward to checking out more of his stuff at some point. I have absolutely nothing to say about this record because I've never heard it. And I know nothing about him, Steve Forbert, Jack Rabbit Slim. It has Romeo's Tune, which is his, one major hit, but never heard the record. So I got this again as part of another collection. So I will not comment on it, although I will say that the things I have read about Steve Forbert seem interesting and relatively promising. So I might like it. Who knows? If you've heard it, let me know in the comments. I struggle with Foreigner. Foreigners 4, which I also got as part of another collection, I believe. Super cheesy. Lou Gramm is a fantastic singer, but I think more than almost any other band, Foreigner was really hurt by overplay when I would be riding with my parents and they'd be listening to classic rock radio. I mean, I heard Jukebox Hero, Waiting for a Girl Like You, and Urgent just on fucking repeat. And even now, having not heard any of those songs in years, I could still sing you the choruses of them, although I won't right now. Urgent has kind of a cool little sax line, which is cool. Kind of adds to it, but and then Jukebox Hero, I mean, Graham goes fucking nuts on the vocals. So I respect Foreigner. I really do, but I never have a desire to hear them. They're one of the bands from the classic rock era that I haven't quite recovered from as far as that level of exposure. So, is what it is. But we're going to end on 2 records that I think are absolutely phenomenal. One of which everybody knows, one of which some people know for sure. RateYourMusic.com, I think, has drawn a lot of people to this album. Certainly drew me into it. Jackson C. Frank's self-titled release from 1965. I'm going to make sure that I get the full thing in here so people can see the name. If you're not aware of Jackson C. Frank, you should be. If we're talking about kind of the idea of a sad white guy with an acoustic guitar, if that doesn't appeal to you, still listen to this record because there's enough kind of genuine blues in here that you might like it. But if you do like sad white guys with acoustic guitars, it more or less starts here. The backstory of Jackson C. Frank, which I'm not going to talk about, is very depressing. This was a guy who experienced a lot of trauma and things from a young age and experienced even more after the recording of this. The story goes that, that Paul Simon discovered him, I think, and that this whole album, I believe, was recorded in 2 or 3 hours in New York. Paul Simon producing and adding guitar on 1 or 2 songs. I think Art Garfunkel was there for the sessions, if I'm remembering what I've read correctly. But Frank his stage fright was so bad that he had to turn around so he wasn't facing anybody. Yeah, it's a very quiet album for the most part. And it's not, it's kind of the same thing I've said about Nick Drake's Pink Moon, where it's not a depressing album per se. But this really does feel like the observations and comments of someone who spends a lot of time in isolation. It is very reflective, forlorn. I mean, this literally a song called I Want to Be Alone, that I think speaks to everything. I think it's a phenomenal song. Blues Run the Game is the most famous one. A lot of people have covered that one, but I think I Want to Be Alone, parentheses dialogue, says a lot about Jackson C. Frank's artistic statement. And this is it. This is the only thing he ever formally released. Everything else has come out in different box sets and things, but there's even some low quality recordings from the 90s when he was kind of rediscovered, when he was, I think, partially blind and, was, slowly dying of like liver failure or something like that. But, yeah, it's a very unique story, this kind of sidebar in the history of 1960s folk music. And I'm glad that more and more people are learning about it, and I hope that, maybe someone watching this video has never heard it and will give it a try, because I adore it. And then we're going to end with a Stone Cold classic. This is my only Marvin Gaye record, What's Going On. There are other great ones that he has, certainly, but I think if we're talking about really, I mean, there's so many ways in which this album excels. Obviously, the social commentary, which is, enough of it is not so specifically focused on racial tensions that it could apply for a lot of situations with social unrest. I think this is an album that does kind of stand out of time because of that possibly intentional lack of specificity in the lyrics. Again, it's obvious what this album is about, as far as being a strong civil rights statement, and some of the songs are very explicit about that. And I think there is something greater to which that he's speaking to here. Also, this record is just a fucking vibe. It's just a fucking vibe. I think there's like a pocket here that Gaye and the backing ensembles and stuff just really hit. And he's just kind of cruising through these things. Now granted, does that mean that like songs like What's Going On, What's Happening, Brother, Mercy, Mercy Me have more or less the same beat to them? Yes, but number one, it's not, it's not a case where it's distracting or anything. It sort of helps you enter into a flow state. And as you're kind of vibing, you're listening to like the things that Gaye is saying, however profound they may be, and just they like resonate with you. I'm doing probably an awful job of explaining just the appeal to this album. And I've heard people say that things like Let's Get It On and Here My Dear are more musically interesting albums. Which, fair enough if that's what you think. I won't disagree, but there's so much value to it. I do love that Rolling Stone made it number one on the greatest albums list recently. I think it's worthy. I think it's extremely worthy. Not saying that something like Highway 61 Revisited or whatever wasn't. Now I can't think of what number one was before, but not that any of that stuff wasn't worthy, but or even that Sgt. Pepper's wasn't worthy. But What's Going On, I think, hits a lot of important points of development, points of focus in the evolution of popular music that I think it serves as a great ambassador. And if it's not your favorite thing in the world, it doesn't have to be. But what I will say is I can't think of very many people who actively dislike this record. I don't know if I can think of anybody. I think everybody agrees that if nothing else, it is smooth, it is nice, and Marvin Gaye is talking about some relevant things. And I think that is the beautiful thing about this album and about music in general, is that even if not everyone is going to agree that it's the greatest thing of all time, everyone can find the value in it. And I think that that's a unique gift. So cool stuff. And on that note, I would like to thank everyone for watching this part of the record collection tour. Please make sure to like, comment, and subscribe. As always, more tours and more reviews are going to be coming. Tell a friend as well. And until next time, I will see you right here at your home of the Music Deep Dive. Bye now.